So there is this story in the Bible, in the Genesis, a creational story. And there are various interpretations. In fact, there are quite few different theological perspectives that have been proposed and argued very passionately for quite some times, specifically and in relation to this moment, in relation to that one of the mysteries, as they're known in Christian language, of the origins of man. And the story of Adam and Eve is interpreted variously. Interestingly enough, when less literal translations of Genesis have been given, then Adam was not a man. Therefore, Eve was not a woman, but rather Adam was a principle, just like Eve, that is essentially was born out of Adam, was also a principle. So there is this interpretation, reading, theological proposition that Adam was in fact androgynous. Androgynous. It was neither a man nor a woman, but both at once. And it would be even more perhaps correct to say that it wasn't neither a man nor a woman, but an embodiment of both principles, masculine and feminine, in equal measure. Some of you may have heard of the term Adam Kadmon. And Adam Kadmon is a very complex and very beautiful, again, metaphysical concept of which shows us the origins of this world. Where according to some of the Kabbalistic teachings, Adam Kadmon is that what came into being after the contraction of God's power took place. In other words, the contraction of that infinite light of God gave birth out of the depth of the abyss, out of the depth of the void, to that what Adam Kadmon represents, primordial being. I will give you immediate analogy with the Hindu, or rather Vedic thought, so that we don't immediately get taken into a specific interpretation where it will have that distinctive biblical flavor to it, or distinctive flavor of this or that tradition. So that Adam Kadmon here is a seed which contains all potentialities in itself. It's the primordial man, it's called, from the capital M. Not man as a gender we're speaking about here, but as that primordial being, a seed of creation, which contains in itself the very power, the very will of God, if you will, in its fullest measure, but with that being said, as Kabbalah teaches, it's still a contracted power, if you will. It's a focused, contracted, concentrated power of otherwise infinite light of God. And out of Adam Kadmon, everything proceeds. Here it is reminiscent to this Vedic perspective of the primordial being Prajapati or Purusha. Prajapati is the being of oneness who undergoes dismemberment. So as to give way for the multiplicity, for the diversity. And the very premises of Vedic culture, which if any of you delve into more than just at an introductory level, you will find an interesting and constant feature, the notion and the concept of sacrifice, the notion and the concept of yagya or yajna, It's that aspect of sacrifice, offering. Sometimes when the term sacrifice is given, people take it too literally and they have problems with that. But it's sacrifice on par with offering. And Vedic spirituality is completely steeped in that concept. When you go in to read the Rig Veda, all the hymns of Rig Veda, it's all about sacrificial rites. All throughout, it's these sacrificial offerings. All this milk pouring over as an oblation. All these other sacrifices, the sacrifices into the fire, all the homas, all the other sacrifices are born out of that. What is this sacrifice here? It is essentially a replica, a recreated replica of that original sacrifice that Prajapati undergoes under tremendous force of desire, which then gives birth to diversity. We're talking from the perspective of the myth, deliberately so. We don't want to yet conceptualize it in, rationalize it, but just let's give ourselves fully to the myth first. So that primordial being undergoes this act of dismembering itself, literally fragmenting itself into diversified field, which gives birth to that what we call universe. And the Vedic concept of sacrifice is considered to be a reverse replica of that what caused diversification. So that the wholeness or oneness or unity or togetherness has been reconciled, and Prajapati is being brought back into the wholeness of being again. It's an interesting concept because an additional feeling is added into that. An additional, if you will, bhava, that Indian term, Sanskrit term for mode, feeling, is added into that. That apparently this dismembering also causes tremendous pain. It is not clear to whom that pain is, but that pain, that act of dismembering need to be reconciled. And therefore, the whole of spirituality here, this very, very rich tradition, is found, or rather steeped, in this aspect, in this sacrificial act, which aims to reconcile, to join these disjointed parts together. to reconnect and to give back wholeness, its integrity. The same we could find in very similar concept of in relation to Purusha. Though immediately, as soon as we say that, so that for those of you who already have delved into reading some scriptures, and perhaps those of you who have been acquainted with the basis of the Samkhya philosophy, which in turn serves as the basis of practically all branches, all Vedic branches, including Ayurveda, then Purusha is spoken from the point of view of Samkhya is slightly different because it is deliberately dualistic philosophy which considers everything to be that Purusha, the immutable spirit, and Prakriti as this nature. And though Prakriti is essentially born out of Purusha, soon as Prakriti is born out of Purusha, she gains its independent status, and there is no connection, as it were, between Purusha and Prakriti. So from the perspective of this dualistic, deliberately, not accidentally, deliberately, there is a purpose, we will talk about it later. This deliberately dualistic perspective points out and as a result outlines various spiritual methodologies, how one can separate Prakriti from Purusha, so that one can regain that status of Purusha, that status of the self uninvolved in the field of activity, that self that is the witness of the phenomena of creation. Because Prakriti, soon as it gains its independence according to Samkhya, then it's subject to its own laws operable within. And these laws are run and governed by three major forces: Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. They're known as gunas in Sanskrit. Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. Sattva stands for equilibrium, light. It's that what keeps it, holds it all together. Rajaguna, Rajas, is the motion, movement, heat, passion. Everything that moves has Rajaguna in it. Everything, whether the body moves or the mind moves, it's because of Rajaguna. And Tamas is inertia, structure, also stupor and ignorance. Tamaguna is not negative, although often when we read yogic expositions, or teachers who come from these traditions would say that it is because of the Tamaguna one cannot overcome that inertia of not being able to move from the status quo, which is true. But in terms of the universal order of creation, it is absolutely necessary, because Tamaguna is that what is responsible for structure. So therefore, if you immediately translate that concept, that perspective into your own physiology, into your own being, you will see that your body is expression of Tamaguna. So in other words, the physiology itself, this structure, is an expression of Tamaguna. So body is already tamasic to begin with. You see? Then the senses that have organs of cognition in the body as the respective places of expression are the expressive potentiality of Rajaguna. So the senses are already in their essence are Rajasic. They are designed to move. The whole point is for the senses to move. If there is a rose, I want to smell it. What's the point? I want to look at it, right? That's Rajaguna in action. And the mind is considered to be an expression of sattva. And it may pose some questions for some of you. And let's look into this. So the mind is considered to be in its essence sattvic. Mind is an expression of sattva. And sattva is that balance, equilibrium. Because the most natural state for the mind is to reflect absolute. The most natural state for the mind is to simply reflect being. That's what mind is in its natural state. But soon as the mind is moved by the incessant activity of the senses, there is a ripple, and there is the movement, and there is essentially mind is taken out of its seat. It begins to fluctuate, vibrate. And that fluctuation leads to what eventually is known as formation of the mental patterns, vrittis, mental modifications. It is not that the mind in itself is an obstacle. It is not that the mind in itself is something that as a nuisance. No. The mind is that what allows the self to be reflected, because that is the very purpose and the quality of the mind. Sattva is, as they say, the nearest to Brahman. Nearest here, of course, is in inverted commas, because gunas abstract. Gunas, these primordial energies with which Prakriti performs all actions, with which Prakriti operates. Prakriti expresses itself through the gunas. Gunas, obviously, are coverings. They conceal that direct experience of being. So it is also understood that even sattva need to be transcended. And also, if you read yogic scriptures or yogic accounts, you will see that even in the advanced being on the path, certain beings become attached to sattva. You can see it in yourself. When you make progress and when you begin to experience the settled states and everything, you become attached to that. You become attached to that goodness, to that balance, to that quality. At some point it's indispensable and is required. So don't jump into conclusions here. Just hear it for what it is. When there is lack of sattva, there is no spiritual progress, cannot be. Because you are incessantly moved by the power of rajas, and there is still tremendous amount of inertia. Yesterday we spoke about it a little bit, why some people easily are naturally curious towards something which is more just what meets the eye, more than just what life is here, through its very diverse field. Because the power of tamas, the power of tamaguna, the power of inertia is so strong in them that it simply does not allow anything. It does not allow much movement. So therefore, in the respective traditions, before one can even begin to build sattva, one needs to have enough motion introduced. So in other words, one needs to steer, move it, to create some kind of motion. And that steering, what will begin to relieve the excess of that tamaguna, so that one can move from that place of being stuck in a status quo of any kind. And that movement is not just moving the body, running, so suddenly you tell someone, okay, you need to move, doing yoga or running or swimming, not to be understood in relation to the body immediately. Because the tamaguna here mostly accumulated in the mind. Mind, which is sattvic, is actually now completely immersed in tamaguna. The quality of the mind is opposite of what it is. Mind is like a clear surface of the lake on a windless night that reflects the moon perfectly on its surface. It suddenly becomes this maya, this mire. This is there's no water circulating, nothing is moving, and it slowly overgrew and totally like the frogs don't even want to be there. I'd like to swim a little bit. It's just like, ugh. Some movement is needed, And again, going back to that, once there is enough movement, once there is this curiosity is awakened in the mind, once there is propensity, once there is desire to move towards something which the mind itself craves greatly, because the mind is sattvic in its nature. What does it mean? That mind already designed, there is this innate, inherent predisposition for that sense of balance, for that sense of inner bubbling joy. Mind is already predispositioned, if you will, for that peace, the peace of mind. We speak about it, the peace of mind. Even the way of the language here, I'm sure you can find equivalent in Spanish and Catalan, in German, in every other language, which reminds this very, very simple folk wisdom. It is therefore, there is already a propensity, and we can also understand why the mind constantly moves somewhere. It moves because there is this propensity to find its fulfillment. It wants to find some fulfillment that is being lost. But when given only to the tendencies that already formed there, given already the tendencies that exemplified by these patterns. What is pattern here? It's experience creating some kind of residue. That residue is like a seed. And that seed, when sown in a fertile ground of this samskaric field, sprouts endlessly with desire to re-experience that. And this is very, if you will, Eastern perspective, that from Indian subcontinent all the way to all the other Oriental cultures, you can find that all philosophies and traditions agree on that. Agree on the notion and the concept of the wheel of samsara. The wheel of samsara is made out of this samskaric field, patterns of experiencing, and that seeds that are sown there, and only to sprout, and only to grow, only to create more, and so forth. And the being is caught in that. And all that the being knows is that. It's literally being caught in that circle of samskara. It's that repetition there. If some of you have read that famous autobiography of a yogi by Paramahamsa Yogananda, he called it nauseating sense of these repeated experiences. It's actually quite apt description, because it has a nauseating feel to it. It's like, I've been here before. I've been here before. I've been here before. Well, you know what? I've been here before. So, taking us back to the Purusha, this kind of a long, prolonged footnote, that Purusha versus Prajapati, in the earlier Upanishadic times, Purusha had a different concept. Purusha was that primordial being. Primordial being the source of it all. And it's interesting that the parallels between Adam, Kadmon, and Purusha is that it's seen as that contraction of that infinite light that is born out of the depth of the void, or depth of that vastness of the void. The void here represents that universal, if you will, universal notion of karma. It's the causal. This is the causal. This is where the seed of creation, just as the seed of individual soul, the seed of each individual soul is in the causal body, where each and every one of us returns every night, as we have spoken about yesterday evening, returns into in a deep sleep, because deep sleep is an expression of the causal realm. It is in the causal realm that the seed of individuality is. Your ego, my ego, everyone's sense of individuality is born or originates in the causal. In the causal. And then, as it were, it grows in the subtle body, which is the expression, or rather the dreaming state is an expression of the subtle realm, only to manifest fully in this realm, physical realm, which we all share in a waking state of consciousness. You see? In a waking state of consciousness, it's the manifestation already. We don't know what our karma is. Therefore, ego concept is so elusive. I would like you to ponder on that for a moment. Ego is not something you can locate. And there's so many different spiritual discussions you have, I'm sure, been exposed to from different perspectives, and ego is being seen from that perspective, from this, how to work with it, but in reality, there is no way one can separate one's ego from one's individuality, because one's individuality here gains its dimension in the realm of the causal, because that's where the seed is. That's where the seed of that individuality, it's in the causal. And that is the reflection of the cosmic orders, or the cosmic, essentially universal picture of how everything comes into being. Pondering on that a little bit more, it will give us also these insights, again, for those of you who have been at it for quite a while. It will give us this explanation also, a direct insight why sages like Ramana Maharshi were simply pointing directly to that the whole world is in the mind. The whole world is in the mind. Because the mind is also the expression of that individuality. Your mind and your individuality are inseparable. And the only way to know that is when in the states of transcendence, mind is transcended, and you don't know who you are in a sense of that identity. Identity is dissolved there, even if temporarily. The reason why it does not hold, even those people who have experienced these deep states of absorption, whilst in that deep state of absorption, one has no corporeal reality. One does not have a reality of so and so. It's simply dissolved, seen through, transcended. But as the consciousness returns into or regains this, if you will, mundane level, then immediately all the structure comes back. And that experience is claimed, of course, by that corporal reality. So one is then naturally attributes that experience to the being who one still considers oneself to be. In other words, it's that I was in samadhi, you see? I, Igor Kufayev, was in samadhi, you see? Where in fact, if you ponder on this carefully, it's the other way around. The Igor Kufayev comes out of samadhi, just as out of seed being comes into the existence. This is the correct understanding. This is a correct contemplation. And this is the way to work with the ego, so that it's not a head-to-head battle. You cannot battle with yourself. No one ever won battle head-to-head. It only reinforces that structure. It reinforces. One may feel that somehow, and you know how often, this is a footnote, do you know how often the bias that if one suddenly becomes humble, and one suddenly becomes this and that, that means one carved one's ego. You see that in every monastery, in every ashramic setup. You see that in every spiritual community. It's like if I'm like this, that means I conquered my ego. No. That's why Swami Muktananda said, is that I'm great or I'm miserable, it's the same thing. It's that coin again. That fool's gold, that fake silver. It makes no difference. As long as there is something comes after I am, it's not essentially any longer that what you are. It's already a figment of that what you are. And that's what is the purpose of the ego here. It's precisely that. It guards the individuality here. But of course it's a profound and very complex theme in itself. But to introduce it here, so that to understand the actual nature of the process. Of course, if one has a repeated experience of that deep absorption, one will eventually get maybe sudden insight that it is that at some point how all this is reclaimed. Unless, of course, the repeated experience begins to transcend already the very structure itself. Then even when coming out of that state of absorption, even when the so-called mundane consciousness takes over, that waking state takes over, one feels transparent in that state. One simply hears one's self speaking. One simply sensing that one is sensing. One simply hears others speaking. But everything as if it's done through this transparency. And this transparency creates that necessarily, if you will, dislodging. This dislodging, at this point, it's a desired disconnection. Because union, right, yoga, goes through the disunion. There are different degrees of union. And at some point, in order for the greater union to take place, there has to be a disunion where the self stands as the witness of the field of activity. And when the self stands as a witness, we call this a plateau where we can camp now. Now unpack your bag. You can put your tent, build your palace. Like, this is a place where you can camp. Because this is a solid place. From here, the final work can be done. But up to that camp, do not unpack and settle for anything. Do not unpack. Take a seat, sip some water, enjoy, smell the flowers, but no, that's not the place. You know how often this assumption like, oh, wow, what an elevated area. I'm like now enjoying the best perspective. And the school spot here. Keep going, in other words. But that separation, essentially, that dislodging is what the purpose of the Samkhya philosophy perfectly extrapolated through the Patanjali Yoga Sutras, which is considered to be the most concise scripture ever written. In fact, the whole scripture is just a few pages. Whatever we see are lengthy commentaries on it. But Patanjali Yoga Sutras would be not even a brochure, it would be just like a leaflet. Concise sutras. All you need to know, boom, 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 boom. And it speaks of that, separating Purusha, the witness, uninvolved, from Prakriti. So that this can be then reconciled, that separation, of course, is not the final. The separation is then further reconciled in another, in Darshana, in the Karma Mimamsa, and finally in Advaita Vedanta. In the 6 systems of Indian philosophy, they all in pairs, Nya, Vaisheshika, the Samkhya and Yoga, Karma Mimamsa and Advaita Vedanta, or Vedanta. So the final step is then to reconcile that apparent duality through that where there is no two. So let us just add here so that we can go all the way back to this, where we started in the inner marriage. So the inner marriage, of course, is here that poetic metaphor for reconciliation of anything that requires to be reconciled. And that, above all else, is in relation to the very, very basis of creation, Therefore, I thought to start with that biblical story of Adam and Eve, where Adam, in a way, again, the reason why ever so slight interpretation of Holy Scriptures that taken in any direction can vastly derail one's mind, take one into completely different sphere, because Scriptures essentially, if you will, like the root of something that is being addressed. And if the wrong understanding is taken, wrong interpretation, if there is a slight concealing of one aspect in favor of the other, then the whole different notion is born. So this whole notion of Adam and Eve has been turned into very much of a story where that fall from, that Adam and Eve, it's almost like this cozy story, in the paradise and in the Garden of Eden. Then everything was fine until it was no longer fine. Adam was apparently bored out of his wits, so he needed to have a partner, right? And then we grow up on these stories, and it's exactly how we function. Then our psyche has this blueprint, and genetically even. If our forebears have these views, accepted these views, and lived with them, then they still have vibrations. They still vibrate through our veins, whether we like it or not. To whatever degree it still does. Yet even within these traditions there were also deeper interpretations, of course, truer interpretations. So Adam here is not a man, it's not some kind of first human. It's that principle. And that principle is androgynous. So the creation of Adam, in fact, is a creation of a human soul, if you will. It's the soul. Therefore, those of you who have ever delved into this, the beauty of the New Testament and the beauty of the very perspective on the place and the role of Jesus is that Jesus came to reconcile the fall of Adam, but it needs to be understood as well that in Jesus, it is in Jesus that the fall of Adam is reconciled. What it means is that it is not the sin of Adam is reconciled in Jesus, as many religious interpretations are here to go by. But it is Jesus which essentially represents the Christ consciousness. It represents the awakened consciousness that reconciles the soul in its state of homeostasis. The fall from the Garden of Eden is nothing other than natural progression of the calcification of the processes, where the soul coagulates to a degree when it gains its entire independence. That's what the fall here exemplifies. There's no other fall. So in other words, the soul is indeed fallen to slumber. And the Christ here represents an awakened soul, which of course reconciles that, as it were, and washes away the so-called sin of Adam. It is that reconciliation, that long-awaited reconciliation, that this particular tradition speaks of. Of course, there are much more complex interpretations, even within Christian theological body of work. There's some profound interpretations. Even from the moment of conception, we gave 2 retreats to that. In particular, one entitled Tantric Christ, some years ago in California, where we have given 7 days, a whole week, to delve into these Christian mysteries, into this very, very notion that each and every single mystery represents, all the way to the Stations of the Cross, seen from Tantric perspective, from the perspective of the esoteric anatomy. So this reconciliation that comes with Christ, just as the concept of Immaculate Conception. The Immaculate Conception here is that concept of the Logos, the Virgin Mary, the Virgin, is not also to be taken literally here. The Immaculate Conception here is that essentially an act of grace which sends vibration through the Logos, which awakens soul from its dormancy, so that to give birth to Christ consciousness. And even as the baby Jesus is born, which exemplifies that very vulnerable phase in one's awakening. All the laws of nature pay tribute to that, exemplified in that adoration. As the king gather, the shepherds and the kings, if you remember, pay tribute and offer, lay down the offerings. So going back to the original myth of Adam and Eve. So what is Eve here? What is the place of Eve? What is Eve? If Adam is not a man, if Adam is a soul, what is Eve? Eve. What is Eve here? Any ideas? What is Eve here? What is the combination? What is who is Eve? After all, she is the one. She's the naughty. Adam was like, she's like naive, That's one solace that in Christianity is given for us guys, is that, I love her. What can I do? She just said, let's pick the apples and eat. It was a big deal, The Eve here is literally that what exemplifies the power of divine feminine on an individual level. Adam, as it were, is incomplete. The soul here, in its androgynous state, is incomplete. So this division is required. That androgynous state, the state of this androgynous state needs to be further divided. And of course that metaphysical and theological interpretations here, whatever one wants to lean towards. In the traditional or more traditional perspective, Eve, that is born out of the rib, one of the Adam's ribs, right? There are a couple of free ribs on each side. The kind of like addition, right? Not really holding much structure there. Just hanging around there, We can definitely use some excess here. great kind of recycling. That what always gave man, you came out of my rib, don't forget that, woman. Just bear that in mind. Again, interpretation, words, interpretation, words, how they interpret it, what do they meant. Do we know that what was in Aramaic? Do we know that what was in, where there were several interpretations at that time? How do we interpret this? What rib stood for? Do we know that? Where is the sources? Do we have the sources? Maybe. I don't have any. But it seems rather plausible that that rib here is simply what is an inherent structure, something what is already part of the inherent structure of the soul. And that androgynous nature, which essentially is genderless. Something needs to born into being, something needs to be given a life of its own, sort of to set off, if you will, the whole world in motion. You need to have this, what otherwise cannot be known, because in order to know something, it can only be known through its opposite. And this division takes place. It's not at all as straightforward. It is that, again, we would need to go into a really, really profound journey which will allow us that insight where we need to have either more, to know more from the given tradition, if we are to speak of this biblical perspective, so as to fully understand, to have a fuller picture of what Adam and Eve represents. And in the context of what we gathered here to address, I feel just to point your awareness in the direction of that inherent, if you will, possibility that what is at the core of your gender is at once genderless, as your spirit is genderless, and at the same time it has these polarities, it has these two aspects, the two that needed for the tango. If you remember, again, in theological explanations and descriptions, that it is just as Adam is rehabilitated, right, with the rest of the world from the original fall with the birth of Jesus. In the same way, Eve is rehabilitated through Mary. Have you ever had that concept? You can find this in the works of very famous theologians. very famous theologians, even those who were not at all banned by the Vatican, but those who were worked under the umbrella, under the protectorate of the Vatican, that talked about it. Thomas Aquinas notoriously wrote about this in great depth, who lived before the Renaissance. Thomas Aquinas, in his works, in his expositions on this, he talked about it and wrote about it. That it is in Mary that Eve is being essentially reconciled. The purity of Eve is being essentially brought back. And the worship of the Virgin Mary, the very worship of the Virgin Mary, that Catholicism is known for, because above all else, the Catholic faith, it's first the worship of the Virgin Mary in its core. In fact, you could see that the leaning, it's like the emphasis on the Immaculate Conception. It's like you can't fully understand the theological expositions on the mysteries without fully having delved into the story of the Immaculate Conception. When the Mary is to carry the Son of God, as the official line tells us. But the cult, if you will, or rather the worship of the Virgin Mary, goes all the way and reconnects. This is the part in official story which connects the pagan times with organized religion. It's that what existed at all times. You cannot eradicate that completely. You cannot remove that. You cannot completely wash it away and re-indoctrinate people in a short period of time. So it naturally, this, what otherwise was always worshipped, that feminine power, that divine feminine that was always worshipped in the pagan times, since whatever, since Paleolithic times, we could argue since what essentially made that leap from a primitive way of life to the life that set the humankind into the dimension of a different kind. And that concept is here, where through Mary, the Eve is reconciled. You can read that, you can see that, if you will translate this into your own story, into the story of your own body, into the story of your own individuality, into the story of your own awakening, into the story of your own desires and longings. Because it is exactly the story where that longing for that innate marriage takes place, is to reconcile this, to go over and reconcile that what otherwise makes us gender bound. Because this being bound by gender, with which we of course fully identify, it's one of the most unquestionable aspects of our identification. I'm not talking about someone who says, you know what, I'm tired to be a man, I want to be a woman. What's the difference, tell me? It makes no difference. I'm tired to be plus, I want to be minus now. You know, it's like it's like you're not going to reconcile nothing here. So the transgender, sexual transgender, does not make any change. It's just like, I'm tired to be dressed as man, I'm going to be dressed as woman. Well, in some cultures it's okay. It's like just part of the national outfit. So what's the big deal? What's the biggie, right? Why am I bringing this example here? Is so that you understand that the very essence of that inner marriage is literally what awakening is inseparable from. Inseparable and indispensable. It's the realization of one's essence, which first goes through the genderless realm, where we give birth to our soul, which is genderless. I want to say that Kundalini, once awakened, it's a way. It makes one androgynous. Not that one suddenly becomes, like more youthful. Of course, we would love that. Suddenly, like, no need to shave anymore, Or looks like the Ardhanarishvara, like suddenly I got one breast growing here. Begin to look quite interesting in the morning when I look at myself in the mirror. It's not like, have you seen these Indian sculptures? He is she, it's called. He is she. It's like the two aspects of the feminine and the masculine all in one. But the genderless nature, the genderless essence of the soul is where that inner marriage takes place. And that inner marriage is the greatest reconciliation of all. And Tantric teaching, without few exceptions, with few exceptions, is what the essence of Tantra is also about from the place and from the point of view of the spiritual anatomy. This is the very essence of the alchemical transformation. That alchemical transformation. So it also gives us greater perspective on all neurophysiological processes in the body. All of them, without exception. In a way, without reconciling, without balancing the masculine and the feminine, there cannot be a peace of mind. Because there is constantly a propensity. There's constantly a propensity to express oneself. And that needs to be understood as well properly, because it's not that one suddenly feels uncomfortable in one's skin. On the contrary, one is uncomfortable in one's skin before one reconciles this. One cannot be fully a man, and one cannot be equally fully a woman, what it represents. Because as long as one is bound by that gender, one cannot be fully that, because man and woman, even as a gender, is both Adam and Eve. Not one is Adam and another one is Eve. This long morning exposition was all to bring our awareness to that. Do you see the difference? That each and every one of us is not expression of Adam versus expression of Eve. Both. It's Adam and Eve, irrespective of our gender. And that's what Tantric alchemy is about. That's what the inner marriage is about. This is where one marries one's own self within. And if one can do that, one is a truly and really happily married. One can truly say one can live happily ever after, because one cannot divorce oneself. It's a different kind of marriage. One cannot separate from oneself. It's an oxymoron. It's a very different kind of commitment there. It doesn't require commitment at that stage. Once that is realized, then one's job in a human body essentially is fulfilled, accomplished, as far as that story is concerned. And of course, it's not that, oh, that is a prerequisite to live a happy life and to relate happily to others. And whether to be alone, or whether to be in a partnership, whether to be in a so-called earthly marriage, or whether to be celibate, or whether to be polygamist or monogamist, is beside the point. It's completely beside the point. Because as long as one's psyche is split in two, that split will translate in every sphere of life. And that split would need to be reconciled. That split also can be traced in Greek mythology. We spoke about Christian perspective, or rather Kabbalistic perspective. You find that in ancient Greek mythology, which also reflects and shares a lot with Vedic mythology, because they say, many scholars agree, that ancient Mediterranean lore was found by the group of migrating people from India. Aryans migrated from India, were the founders of the early settlers in the Peloponnese and then the islands and so forth. You can find out it for yourself. And the formation of all this, they're known as the ancient Greek myth, but they're really ancient Mediterranean myths, because ancient Greek myths spread around. Hercules goes all the way to Atlas Mountains to fetch the apples, as we know it, right, from the garden of Hesperides. Dionysius riding the panther from India. Argonauts go to Colchis, to contemporary Georgia, to bring that golden fleece. Orpheus himself is born in Egypt. And there is this myth, and the creational myth. There's a story, Hesiod, the compiler of these myths, and earlier centuries of the formation of the Greek culture, ancient Greece. Hesiod is known who put together all these myths in the poetic form. And this is how we know them. Before that, they were all scattered and probably given as a lore from chest to chest. According to one of these creational myths, is that Zeus, when he feared for man becoming very strong, when man obtained fire after Prometheus, as you remember, as you may know, stolen that fire and given it to the humankind so that they get independence from gods, as it were, through the supremacy of God, so that the man can have power of their own. That's fire represented. And seeing how strong man has become, Zeus split them in half, essentially. Before that, they had well, it may sound scary for some of you, but that's how the myth goes. Before they had 4 arms and 4 legs. The first proto-humans. And then he split them in half and made female and male and scattered them around so that they constantly look for each other. Instead of getting strong, instead of being that whole, they now forever looking for happiness by finding another half in the worldly plane. So he set in motion, if you will. It's a myth, right? It's all in our awareness. Zeus is nothing but our awareness, it's our consciousness. Something in our consciousness causes that split. And we look for happiness in the other. We're looking for happiness and actually making other responsible for our happiness. So it's the whole psychology is then being born. So that don't get distracted by, or disgusted by the 4 arms and 4 legs, though some mothers maybe will do with 4 arms sometimes, it can be quite handy. Here, maybe looking at the recipe while mixing the porridge. You never know. How practical can it be? Certainly the morning ritual can be much faster, There's a lot of things you can do. But the story, is a story. Boom! Now they're busy looking for each other. None of them are here to overthrow the hierarchy of stuff. I can sit quietly on my Olympus and eat manna. Anyhow. Okay. I think if you some of you wrote it down, I did.
Individual expression. Divine feminine power.
It's okay. Part of the Tantric teaching is to confuse through elaborate metaphor. So we pay respect to tradition and don't put all the dots on E. It is for you to discover it. It is for you to tap into it. So that's probably it for morning storytelling. And if you have questions, would you be able to hold them till later?